First, you have to promise me you won't laugh. This is still an uncomfortable subject for me, so I'd appreciate your understanding. Do we have a deal? When I was 5 years old, I watched a movie no child should ever see. I don't remember much about the circumstances of my viewings other than that I was at my house where my family lived, late at night, in the dark only with the television providing light. The film was an animated feature and depicted themes of animal cruelty, death, and dismemberment. The scenes were surreal and terrifying and left a deep impression on me. For years afterwards, the only scene I would remember clearly was when the evil woman was drowning a family of cats in a stream, which I would have nightmares for years afterwards. I remember seeing it early in the movie, followed by many more disturbing and surreal scenes. Remember your promise, because this is the part where I was talking about. I never told anybody about what I saw, but the name of the movie was well known. The Aristocats. I suppose I can forgive you if you broke your promise, but I must emphasize that I'm not joking. I saw a movie called The Aristocrats filled with the scenes I have described, and it scarred me for life. I don't think about the experience very often, but it always is in the back of my mind in some way. Though I didn't realize it at the time, I know now that it's caused me to shy away from animation and children's shows. It subtly informed my whole outlook on the trappings of childhood. I found myself bracing with dreams whenever I had to watch my children's animation in school. My childhood was relatively normal otherwise, for an introvert anyway. But every once in a while, I would think back about the movie and find my inner peace disturbed. It wasn't until maybe 3rd or 4th grade that I started to realize that my experience with this movie had not been typical. I didn't tell anyone, not even my parents, and what I had witnessed in that dark room at the age of 5, but I eventually figured out on my own that there was nothing horrifying about the version everybody else had seen. I still wasn't willing to see for it myself, but I figured if they had seen what I'd seen, I would have been able to tell whatever they spoke of the film. Anyone who has anything to say about it seemed to consider it either a nostalgic classic or an unremarkable. When I was in middle school, I asked my mom if I had ever seen The Aristocrats, which she said I had once, having stayed up past my bedtime and watching it secretly. She said I seemed strangely disturbed by the film, and I had never watched it again as a small child. I asked if we still had it in the house, but she said that I had been so afraid of the movie that she had thrown it out. It had been a home VHS recording she bought at an estate sale, rather than a retail copy. I finally decided to watch the movie again. I ordered it from the library and watched it one Saturday. It took me a couple of hours to work up the courage to finally hit play. I found it to be a wonderful film immediately. I realized that whatever I remember seeing at the age of 5 had nothing to do with this movie. There was no graphic violence, no psychedelic scenes, nothing that would have traumatized me as a child. And yet, what I had seen all those years ago definitely share elements within this movie. The kittens in this mother were drugged and kidnapped, but not drowned. But I instantly recognized the moments leading up to this divergence, and almost had a flashback to the cartoon drowning I had witnessed. I was hoping to find some closure, but instead, I was more troubled than ever. There was no question in my mind now that I had viewed some awful and perverted version of this classical film. I told one of my friends about it a few days later, and I didn't tell him about how convinced I was about what I had seen as a young child. Instead, simply relating it as a vague and confused memory, like, hey, the other day I saw The Aristocrats. I used to be terrified of that movie because of some reason I thought I saw gore scenes and cats drowning when I was 5 years old. Funny how your memory plays tricks on you at that age, isn't it? He told me about the movie Fidele. He explained that it was an animated movie about cats with a similar animation style that contained graphic gore scenes and was definitely not for children. He said that maybe I had somehow seen that movie instead of The Aristocrats. I streamed and watched Fidele, and I saw what my friend meant about the style having the same feel as The Aristocrats, except darker and bloodier. But it wasn't what I had seen. I knew for sure that 5-year-old me had watched a movie with the same characters as The Aristocrats, as I also knew for a fact that it had contained bizarre and disturbing scenes not shown in the mainstream version. This whole thing was driving me up the wall. To say To try and get some kind of closure, I started seeking out and watching old children's animations that contain graphic and disturbing elements that would never be influenced today, such as Watership Down, the 1978 version. While these works were interesting and gripping in their own way, they were decidedly not Disney. While other studios may have been willing to take such risk with their works decades ago, the fact that The Aristocats is a Disney property made me sure that the version I had seen was something I was absolutely not supposed to see ever. I let it go for a while. A few years passed, and in college I learned about this internet urban legend called Lost Episodes. People claim to have seen episodes of TV shows or altered versions of movies, usually animated, that contain graphic or disturbing content. The episodes or movie was often found in unexpected places, and those claiming to have seen it often said it mysteriously disappeared, whether through a VHS tape appearing to have somehow self-erased, or a website going dead immediately after viewing, etc. To be honest, I didn't put much stock in the validity of these stories, but with my Aristocrats experience still back in my mind, I decided to look further into it. I found a YouTube channel called Cartoon Geek, who was discussing a certain lost episode for his 40,000 subscriber special. After going through the obligatory thanks and talking about how much his subscribers mean to him and all that, he began, "Now for those of you who are new to this channel, I'm basically just a guy obsessed with all things nostalgic, and geeky about cartoons and other media. Most of my content is simply reviewing old cartoons and whatnot, usually superhero related. However, I also did side series for the strange and creepy side of animation. For example, my 20k sub special was a 3-part series on Disney and their alleged subliminal messages in film and television, and this video you're watching now is sort of the same vein. We're going to be taking another look at a certain lost episode. For those of you who don't know, lost episodes are basically this urban legend about episodes of TV shows which were lost, as the name implies. These episodes are said to contain graphic and or disturbing and surreal imagery, and are generally regarded as material to the public was not meant to be seen. A few months ago, I covered an alleged lost episode from the 1968 Filmation series, The Adventures of Batman. I loved this show as a kid, even though it was a few decades before my time, and there was one episode with a scene where Batman and Robin fall through a trapdoor set by Joker and slide toward their doom. At the end of the slide tunnel is a giant open furnace, looking like the Joker's face. Of course, since it's a kid show, they don't actually slide into the furnace and burn alive. They get out with their gadgets. So to recap, in 2009, this anonymous internet post started circulating around an alleged lost version of the scene. In it, the dynamic duo actually do slide into the furnace, burn alive, scream, and are shown graphically being burnt to a crisp, followed by surreal and non-linear scenes of grieving friends of Bruce Wayne in mourning in the funeral service. Now, when I did my first video on this subject, I was honest with you guys. I didn't really think there was much credibility to this show. I like to keep an open mind about this, but there were just certain elements of this post that made me say, okay, this post is bullshit. Like, how the tape conveniently erased itself after the author anonymously viewed it. But since I had gotten a lot of comments and emails talking about how allegedly the lost episode has been posted online, naturally a lot of you are already saying that this is fake. But this topic went out of a poll for a special, so let's find out. After some more preamble, the video cut to the alleged lost episode. At the part where Batman and Robin were sliding down the tunnel towards the furnace, all the parts where the two used their belt gadgets to go free were removed, and the two were then close to the furnace. The screen then filled with fire, and two poor quality shrieks played. After that, there were some strange abstract scenes, but all of these seemed to be simple random clips from other episodes with some edifying effects thrown at them. Cartoon Geek returned saying, "Okay, so right off the bat, Batman and Robin die off screen, which is obviously not what happened in the lost episode post that was shared around. They basically just used the flames from earlier in the scene and cut them over to make them look like Batman and Robin died, adding in a canned scream effect. The surreal scenes that follow are also just random clips from throughout the show with various editing tricks applied. I could have even done some of them myself. So while this is an impressive work, I think it's pretty clear that this is just a fan project inspired by the anonymous post. I'm going to rate this animation myth as debunked for now. He gave some more breakdown on the deconstruction of the clip before ending with some kind of promotional giveaway. What really got my attention, however, was some of the comments. There was at least a few people insisting that lost episodes were real, and that they had seen it with their own eyes. I PM'd one of these people, and I asked if he had really seen the episode about the circumstances. He responded within the hour. Yeah, I was at summer school and during recess, I snuck off to one of the school's library back rooms to be alone. I put a VHS tape of one of the cartoons that was there and I saw it. Honestly, I wasn't really disturbed back then, since my parents let me watch R-rated horror movies and stuff like that back then. But yeah, man, this thing is real. I asked if he knew any information about the other supposed lost episode phenomenon, but he said that he did not. I did some research on my own, and there was a few lost episode stories floating around on the internet, mostly of children's shows, to be honest. Not many of them seemed all that credible. Still, I strongly felt that there was something real behind all the establishment fictionalization. I decided to see if there was any more stories surrounding the Aristocats. My searches for disturbing content of the movie returned nothing more but the expected, this one scene in Aristocrats totally scared me, life as a kid stuff, or more information about the Fidele movie. I tried researching out to some of the credited animators, writers, and crew members, verifying the content of my emails just so as to cast a wide as net as possible. For example, some of my emails focused on disturbing content that may have been cut, while other drafts asked generally about alternate versions or cutscenes. I also expanded my web searches. I used all the search engine tricks I could find, and started using obscure and foreign language engines. After a few months of, no information and no responses from my email queries, I started to think that maybe I should just forget about the whole thing. Maybe my real memories of watching the Aristocats had merged in with some nightmare I had to create my present memories. And maybe repeating these memories to them myself so many times during my childhood had falsely convinced me of their reality. I was about to consign to this newfound self-enclosure when I found something during one of my foreign language searches. It was a thread on a Chinese message board. The OP had a JPEG image and text that roughly translated to, "Aristocrats movie creepy?" If I had a coffee to drop or spill all over my computer, I would have. The image dashed away any hope I had of passing off my childhood experience as just a traumatic nightmare that had stuck in my head longer than what it should have. It was a frame from whatever twisted version of the Aristocrats I had seen, and while I hadn't actually remembered this particular still until I had found the message board, the instant I saw it, I remember the clip and more memories started flooding back. Still vague, but vivid and definitely real. I was now more firmly convinced than I had been ever before that the violent version of the movie was certainly real. The image was of the black kitten Berzoli. His face nearly filled the frame, and his eyes were wide and terrified, red veins bulging, his fur standing up as if charged with electricity. The picture itself wasn't any more inherently disturbing than the grotesque fan art you can find of all kinds of different shows and movies. But unlike these other images, I knew this one had to have a genuine sinister story of some kind behind it. As much as it haunted me like no other image had, there were only a couple of replies on the thread, both of which were short, and neither of them provided any more information about the image. I used Google Translate to try and ask the OP for more information, but never received a response. I performed a reversed image search on the file, but it returned no other results. However, a few weeks later, I finally got a reply on one of the emails I sent from the production staff. The reply was to one of my emails that I had written that hinted more strongly to the reality of what I'd seen as a kid. The response was short and curt, but gave me new hope for finding answers. "Hello. Sorry for the late response, but I read between the lines of your message, and if you've seen what I think you are hinting at, you need to look into the Lost Media Group. That's all I'm going to say about the subject." I googled Lost Media Group, but the closest thing I could find was a website for online club called the Lost Media Society. It was a site for media enthusiasts to collect, trade, sell, buy, and discuss lost media, including lost episodes, as in real lost episodes that simply never aired, not the urban legend ones that contain surreal, disturbing, or even supernatural content. This community was interested in its own right, and I became involved with it, eventually even becoming a site moderator. Once I was established as a respected regular, I decided to PM one of the head admins and ask him about the lost episode legend. He responded that he had heard of it, but it wasn't really something the site dealt with. He recalled that in the past it had been talked about and some had even suggested banning discussions about it when it was seen as a spam topic for a while. I asked if he knew about an organization called the Lost Media Group. He said he had heard of it but didn't know anything about it, and suggested that I contact a certain other admin who did know more about this entity. I messaged this admin and got a response within the hour. He told me the Lost Media Group was a group alleged by some to be behind the Lost Episodes phenomenon. According to him, they produced not just altered versions of movies and television episodes, but were also said to make their own versions of other media such as video games and comic books. He said he didn't know much else other than that they were some lost media collectors that were willing to pay large sums for an authentic work by this group, and that before the Lost Media Society had banned discussions of the Lost Episodes legends, some of the collectors had asked them about the site. I asked if he could refer to me to such a collector. He said that my best bet would be a certain retired site admin that no longer was active on the Lost Media Society. He linked me a couple of archived threads about this individual asking about lost episodes, and gave me the man's email address. I shot him an email address about his interest in lost episodes, and even went so far to directly ask if he knew about a lost episode type version of the Aristocrats. A few months went by with no response. During this time, I researched as much as I could about the lost episode. I found out about another alleged lost episode of the Flintstones. The story behind this episode was much like any other lost episode story. A special episode of the show aired on an otherwise unused television channel and had gory and surreal content. The main difference between this story and others was that this one had a somewhat credible outside source. The original forum post had a link to a digitally archived local news article from 1979. The FCC had received complaints from dozens of people claiming to have seen this episode. The complaints came from the Lake Kennebunk region of Minnesota, which most originating from the couple of specific lake resorts. The incident was locally known as the Ketogama broadcast. I decided the next logical step was to contact the FCC for more details. They responded within the week saying that unfortunately they were not at liberty to give out such information. At the moment, I considered filing a Freedom of Information Act request, but decided to take a different route. One of the two lake resorts most heavily involved with the incident was still in operation. I scheduled a vacation from work, and a few weeks later, I was on my way to Lake Kalamaya. Kelk's Cove was a collection of 15 cabins, a bar restaurant, and a small boat dock with boats available for lease. I had rented an old A-frame unit and planned to stay for 2 weeks. The resort was a nice place to stay. I spent a few days fishing and seeing local attractions. I fell with a group of regulars who finished at the resort every year. We went on several boat trips before I had enough courage to ask Yoldis about the Kelogama broadcast. Oh, that funny thing? I actually missed out on that whole thing. Happened a week before I stayed here in the summer of '79. I heard a lot about it, though. You'll want to talk to Ed about it. He was there. He was referring to Ed Kelk, the founder and proprietor of Kelk's Cove. I had considered asking about the Carabao broadcast before, but wanted to feel out the locals first. However, at this point, I decided I was being overly cautious and chose to follow the man's advice. Mr. Kelk was in his late 70s, but his memory was still sharp. He liked to tell stories and I took advantage of this by starting a conversation with him about the history of the resort and the lake. This got him going for a couple of hours before I brought up the Karabagama broadcast. Now, why do you want to know about that? He asked, seemingly taken aback. I told him I had read about it on the internet and what the story said. He shrugged and said, "Oh well, there's pretty much what happened. Nothing much else to really tell, really." I asked if he had seen the episode, to which he responded that he had caught the end of the broadcast after being told about it was happening. He said that he saw Barney die a horrible and bloody death by some fake Stone Age contraption, but didn't remember much else. He was reluctant to continue the conversation much further, but assured me that the incident was very real indeed. I pondered all that I had learned in my drive home, and I had been left with more questions than answers, and it didn't seem to be getting any closer to tracking down the Aristocats' lost recording. The more I learned, the more new questions came up. Was the disturbing Aristocats version I had seen connected to the Columbine broadcast, or the alleged Batman and Robin lost episode? Or was I making connections where there were none? Did that person on YouTube who claimed to have seen the Batman lost episode really see it, or was he just trolling me? Surely all these claims couldn't have been coincidental, but there was no explanation for the existence of these lost episodes. While I was turning all this information over in my mind, I didn't notice the vehicle behind me until it was right up on my bumper. I swerved as it made contact and caravaned into a ditch. The other car drove on without stopping. I wasn't injured. In fact, my airbag hadn't even deployed, but I sat in shock for many minutes afterwards. When I finally got my bearings, I called 911 and told them about my location based on the nearest mile marker. It took about 45 minutes for a state officer to find me. I told the police what had happened, but wasn't able to provide details such as the make and color of the car that had hit me or the license plate. I didn't tell them about what my business was, or my lingering suspicion that the incident had to do with my investigation of the Carabana broadcast. Despite this experience, I decided to stick my neck out a little more. This was getting serious, and I needed a clear picture of what I was up against. I had an antiquant in the FBI who owned a family favor of a lifetime. I convinced him over dinner that I paid to look into the lost media group for me. A few weeks later, he had a document for me. It was an analysis report containing all the information the FBI had on the mysterious group. The information known about the Bureau about the lost media group is so scant as to strongly suggest the group does not really exist. The report assumes the existence of the group for investigation purposes. However, most of the information contained herein is more speculated than confirmed. Most of the testimony concerned the LMG has been hearsay and off the record. The exact nature, size, organization, origins, and goals of the LMG are mysterious. It is said to be a multi-international organization and is embedded in multiple entertainment industries and is most active in cities with large concentrations of entertainment companies, such as Los Angeles, New York City, Atlanta, Toronto, and Tokyo. Membership is by invitation only and is rumored to include a number of wealthy entertainment executives and financiers. Second-hand informants report that the group used a variety of criminal tactics, including bribery, blackmail, and violence, to prevent the dissemination of information concerning them. It is speculated that the LMG used other crime syndicates as proxies for their operations in order to obfuscate investigations into their activities, and that they mislead people into believing that they are the most powerful group than they really are. Claims that the group possesses supernatural powers are likely the result of selective disinformative campaigns. The Lost Media Group first came into the Bureau's attention during the 1970s, but is said to date back into the early 1900s, during the 1920s and 1930s. An urban legend emerged concerning mystery reels, which were said to be altered versions of syndicated movie theater reels that differed significantly in context and tone from their standard copies. The Bureau believes that the lack of public awareness in entertainment industry standards and copyright contributed to the fact that such works were not reported to the media or law enforcement. A recurring theme in testimony concerning mystery reels is that they often contain violent content that was more extreme than mainstream theater content, and several former members of censorship boards had claimed to have received complaints about them. Witnesses also claimed that mystery reels based on live-action films feature different actors and that these actors in retrospect seem to have been coerced. One witness claimed that an actor in a silent mystery reel appeared to be saying "help me" before being silenced by someone off screen. These claims have led to the Bureau to believe that the LMG had participated in trafficking in human beings. The group is also rumored to have been involved in the participation and distribution of snuff films, though there is as little evidence to support this claim as there is to support the very existence of snuff movies. Other crimes of the Lost Media Group is suspected to be involved, with included media piracy, drugging of actors, trafficking in endangered species for use in films, and recording executions for other criminal organizations. I pondered over the report. Membership by invitation only. Well-funded, well-connected, must be well-organized. yet their activities seemed nothing short of bizarre. Why would a group with these kind of resources they apparently had, unlike the FBI? I was beginning to take an existence of the Lost Media Group for granted at this point, not really spending them on more traditional and profitable criminal activities. Why would that many people commit to many resources and risk so much just to make movies? There was no way that such a sophisticated syndicate would make enough money off this simple piracy to be considered profitable, and the other crimes listed in the report would seem beyond the scope of expertise and capable obscenity comprised of people in the entertainment industry. Was it not about money? An ideological or religious motivation, perhaps? Certainly it didn't fit any religion I could think of, and it didn't seem that they were interested in influencing elections. Their motivations must have been subtler. They had a message they wanted to send or an influence they wanted to create, using the power of mass media, and were willing to dabble in any number of crimes towards whatever their ultimate end was. A few weeks later, I received a reply from the former Lost Media Society admin, the one who was said to have attempted to collect lost episodes. He told me that he was not aware of Aristocat's lost episode version, but that he was nonetheless now in possession of several lost episode copies, and was willing to show them to me for a price. To be exact, he wanted $3,000. I agreed without hesitation. I was not at a point in life where I could comfortably spend $1,000 on anything, let alone a prospect that might not deliver, but I was afraid trying to talk him down to a lower offer would make him break contact, or something in my gut told me his claims at least were sincere. He gave me his address of a secluded cabin he said he would rent for the purpose, which was several states away. He said to come alone and give me the exact date he expected me there. I was a little put off by this curt tone, but figured he was paranoid of someone stealing his collections, or worse, being hunted down by the people who made the items. I prepared for the trip and left immediately. When I arrived in the state where the cabin was, it was still a couple of days until our meeting date, so I checked into a hotel. I was up late, watching TV in my hotel room with the lights off, when I found a channel playing the Aristocats. I was in the middle of the movie, but I kept watching. I grew nervous. I had already watched the whole movie, and knew there was nothing unwholesome in the standard version. But the setting alone in the dark with just the light of the TV was strongly reminiscent of my traumatic virgin experience with this feature. Soon, though, my unease turned to comfort. I realized that there was nothing to fear. Sure, at this point I was convinced that somewhere out there existed a violent, twisted version of the Aristocats, one of which I had been unfortunate enough to somehow see as a child, but that didn't really matter. It couldn't hurt me now. I laughed as I realized I now had the chance to relive the memory without the trauma, so I grabbed a snack and continued watching in the dark, for once able to enjoy the film as I was intended to be enjoyed. I was able to appreciate what a truly great movie it was, how much effort was being put into the animation and voices, and how great the music was. The soundtrack was a little distorted, though. As I turned up the volume to hear it better, I realized that it wasn't the TV. The music became faster and more distorted, and the scene began morphing into abstract images. I heard screams from the TV and disturbing images too brief to make out clearly flashing on the screen. This all ended with a still image of Brawls, the one I had found in the internet with his eyes bloodshot. On the image were 2 words in red caps. Stop asking. The scene then went to black. I sat there in total darkness, my body quaking, tears and snot running down my face, hardly able to catch my breath. I turned on the lights, threw up in the bathroom, and switched the channel. All the stations were playing normal television, which was somewhat comforting, but I still checked out the hotel and went into a different one. At this point, I considered giving up on the hunt. My first goal had been to find out if lost episodes were real, and I had certainly achieved that at least. Without going further and finding out the exact nature and origin of them was worth it, becoming an increasingly dubious prospect. Whoever was behind them had powers and resources to seriously threaten me, and I didn't know if full closure was worth risking my neck any further. In the end, I decided to keep going through. I was close now, and if there was some secret, powerful group behind all these lost episode stories, the world needed to know. Who were they, and trying to imitate me to giving up? No, I wouldn't give up the hunt. At this moment, I doubled down in my determination at this appointed time. I showed up at the cabin. It was night, and the moon flooded the lonely cabin in an eerie glow. There was a vehicle in the driveway, but the lights were out, and there was no sign of occupancy. I timidly walked up and knocked on the door without turning on any lights. The man greeted me. For his own safety, I will not describe the man, save to say he appeared middle-aged. So you were serious about this? Good. Do you have the money? I gave him the suitcase of cash. He turned a lamp on and counted it out, then motioned for me to follow him into another room. He closed the door behind him before turning on the light. The room had a high ceiling and nature paintings on the wall, along with a single shelf of old books that were clearly there for decoration. Centered on one of the walls was a large plasma television. There was a lot of space, but the man himself only had to put out a couple of chairs and some plastic storage tubs on the floor. So, here's my collection. It ain't very big, but you'll have a hard time finding these items anywhere else. Sorry to have to charge you so much, but you gotta realize I'm taking a huge risk by showing this stuff to a stranger, so you gotta make it worth my while. I trembled with anticipation. At least I was about to have some real concrete answers. Like I said in my email, I don't have, nor have I ever heard of an aristocrat's video made by these people. But from how you described it, I completely believe you saw it. It fits right in the kind of thing they would make, he continued. By they, you mean the Lost Media Group? I interjected. Yeah, they would be behind the thing you saw, along with the Batman Lost episode if it indeed exists, though I haven't been able to find it myself. But again, wouldn't be surprised. I don't know what their goals are in making these things, but they're interesting as all hell, so I collect them. I asked if he could share some of his contacts, but he flatly refused. I only give that information to trusted friends. And even if you were one of them, I'd make you pay more than what you could afford. Please don't ask that again. You're lucky I'd even allow to show you my collection. I was a little flustered by his tone, so I just nodded. Then we got down to business. He opened one of the tubs and pulled out a VCR, along with a black VHS tape with a white label that read Pink Panther in black Sharpie. He hooked up the VCR and inserted the tape and played it. It was a lost episode from the Pink Panther cartoon series, which was a show consisting of short sketches about 5 or 6 minutes each, with the Pink Panther going on various solo adventures and getting into trouble with other characters and situations, which he manages with a superior mastery of cartoon physics. There was never any dialogue, save for the occasional wordless explanations or babbling nonsense, like in Tom and Jerry cartoons, and every short has the Pink Panther theme playing throughout. I had watched a little of this show as a kid, but didn't really have much memories about it. The episode was called 40 Shades of Pink, which I assumed to be a pun on how Ireland had said to have 40 Shades of Green, since this was a St. Patrick's Day themed episode. It took place in a Greenland that, while not explicitly identified as Ireland, was obviously supposed to be the Emerald Isle, or at least some generic insular Celtic fantasy island. The short involved the Pink Panther trying to steal a pot of gold from a leprechaun, or rather, the recurring little man character dressed up as one. As the Pink Panther was walking over the rainbow like a bridge, a storm had caused it to disappear from underneath his feet. He fell, and there was a sickening crunch sound. The Pink Panther was shown bleeding out on the ground, bones jutting out. Then he saw the leprechaun's pot and crawled over to it. Despite his injuries, a smile of victory crawled over his face. As he peered down into the pot, the leprechaun appeared from behind and pushed him in, closed the lid over him, and then roasted him over a fire. The episode ended with the sound of the Pink Panther screaming. Lame, I thought. Someone basically just took the Pink Panther cartoon and gave it an itchy and scratchy treatment. It was somewhat disturbing that whoever did it clearly had access to the original animation resources to make it look exactly like a real episode. But overall it was underwhelming compared to what I was expecting. The next item was a copy of The Lion King. This time it was a proper factory copy with a retail jacket. The man told me the movie itself was normal, but that there was a special animated short at the end of the tape with the psychedelic properties. He warned me that the experience would be far more intense than the Pink Panther tape, and even asked me if I had any heart conditions. Despite his warnings, I insisted that he go on with it. He refused to fast forward to the short, saying he wanted to keep the tapes from warping even though he had the footage digitally archived. After the credits, there were some special features, including some animated shorts I had never seen before. when the title card appeared for a short called The Lion, the man paused and asked once again if I was sure. I wanted to proceed. I nodded and he played it. The short feature was what apparently was a version of Scar, but its art style was completely different. It was a 2D animation, but somehow much more realistic than Pixar animation. It's hard to explain. It's much like CGI realism, but there was so much detail and effort put into the character that it gave the impression of realism while still being paradoxically fanciful. The clip showed Scar walking down a white background before stopping his face to the viewer. The camera began slowly zooming on his face, and his eyes began glowing red. Threatening jungle music began playing. Suddenly I became very nervous. A vicious grimace appeared on Scar's face, the kind a predator would make before striking. His mouth opened wide, showing rows of sharp teeth, and I heard realistic growling sounds. His face wrinkled in a pattern consistent with the face of a lion makes before pouncing. My nervousness turned into terror. My gaze was transfixed on the screen and I couldn't look away. I knew it was only animated, and even if it wasn't, the lion couldn't get to me through the screen. But I was paralyzed as if I was facing a real predator. I was in a trance, one that didn't break until Scar jumped and I screamed for my life. I kept screaming until the man shook me out of it. "Sorry about that," he said, "but I did warn you." Once I got my bearings back, I asked for the next item. He gave me a puzzled look, as if he had expected me to just give up and want to go home after the last tape, but he shrugged and got the next one. It was another home VHS tape labeled Super Bowl 2000. This next one won't do anything to you like the Lion video, but it's disturbing in what it shows. In fact, I'll just tell you what it is. This tape shows a riot that didn't happen. If you didn't know, there were no sports riots in the 2000 Super Bowl, certainly not in the stadium itself, but the tape shows just that. Once again, the man refused to skip to the interesting part to preserve the integrity of the tape. In the third quarter, a referee made a call that didn't sit well with the Titans fans, and someone threw a beer bottle. More people started throwing things, and it escalated into a full-scale riot in which spectators swarmed the field and attacked each other. You could see the majority of the crowd slowly evacuating the venue, while a small but determining segment began vandalizing the place and having sporadic brawls. There was no commentary at this point, just raw stadium footage that cycled through various venue cameras. Around 20 minutes into the riot, the tape ended. The tape didn't cause me to experience abject terror like in the last one. In fact, the riot hadn't been much that hasn't really been that bad compared to the other speed riots I've seen. But I found it disturbing on a deeper level. The fact that they could alter a recording of sports events to make it show something that so blatantly didn't happen is really terrifying. They could only have done that in one of two ways: with editing techniques that were well beyond what was publicly known to the world, or with some type of magic. I had asked him to see the next item. The man said that it was the last one. It was a plug-and-play video game this time. The man explained that the Lost Media Group were known and dabbling in other mediums besides movies and television, and that in particular they were said to produce a lot of lost video games, though this was the only one that had been able to be required. The game was labeled Pokemon Black Carbonite. I actually remember hearing about Nintendo making a Pokemon plug-and-play game that was cancelled, but I didn't know if that was the title. The thing was black and bore a white image of Pikachu, supporting a menacing grin. "I'm not gonna let you play this. I myself will never play it again. This thing will mess you up and it's downright dangerous. You can examine the hardware though." I took it from him and did so. The first thing I noticed upon closer inspection was a fissure of the control pack. A lot of force had been applied to make this crack, when I noticed that some of the plastic was warped and melted. I looked at the man, and he gave me a look back, a look of understanding that there was nothing more that needed to be said. I handed the game back to him. The man had said some goodbye formalities, put his hand over my shoulder, and aggressively led me to the door, closing and locking it behind me. He never saw my camera. During the Lion short, I had managed to snap a quick digital photo of the TV screen while the man wasn't looking, and then put the camera back away before the whole bad acid trip thing. I had the photo enlarged and enhanced and studied it, and I was still frightened, even without the psychedelic properties of the animated short. Again, despite it being a cartoon, it had such detail and realism that it seemed more alive than I thought the cartoon would be. I did some research on art and animation styles, and learned that this technique was known as hyperrealism, a style intended to give intense, lifelike detail using traditional non-digital art methods. Some pieces of this genre are almost indistinguishable from photographs. The lion wasn't quite that realistic. You could still tell easily enough that it was a cartoon. Yet it somehow was visibly striking as a real photo of a lion. I continued my research, now focusing on finding people who were knowledgeable about the art form. I narrowed my search down to a few academics and animators, and emailed them the lion still. I had gotten a response from one of the experts saying that the style reminded him of John Sabrai, an Austrian artist and animator who had moved to the United States in the 1930s. He had worked for Disney briefly before starting his own animation studio. He was known for his bizarre, deconstructionist approach to animation, and had started his own small, anti-art sort of movement. Animators and cartoonists trained in his studio produced their own bizarre works, which often included violent and grotesque themes, despite the fact that the studio ostensibly marketed to children. The email went to explain that Strobe became increasingly obsessed with magic and the occult during his career. He became less and less functional until his studio was forced to close due to bankruptcy. Curiously, the studio was known to produce only a handful of original works of its own. Apparently, the animators had spent a lot of time deconstructing and then recapitulating the works of many companies, mainly Disney's, since they were the only major animation studio at the time, and altering them to make them surreal or disturbing. This would have opened the company up to piracy claims, except that they never sold such works to the public, instead gifting them to a handful of collectors within the anti-art elite community. Strobe had also published a book, a manual of sorts which contained prints of some of his still cartoons and instructions of his techniques. It was simply entitled Animation Deconstruction. I simply determined to read it, but it took me ages to find a copy. I managed to track one down at a public library headquarters 3 states away. The book was in their special archived collection, so I couldn't get through their inner library alone. I had to drive there, which they would allow me to examine it in their archive reading room. The room was sparse, dusty, and poorly lit. It had a feel of a 1950s police interrogation room. I was allowed to read the book of interest at the single table under the supervision of a librarian. It was yellowed and the jacket was warped in a protective plastic. The volume was short enough to read in an hour. Strobe was not good at English as he was at drawing, so the self-published aspect really showed the numerous grammar errors. There were a couple of dozen prints in the book, all made in this unique hyperrealistic style. Again, they weren't photorealistic like other authors in the genre, but had a depth of detail and perspective that made them appear alive, all the same. None of them did anything paranormal or anything like that, but there was one that managed to seriously frighten me. It was a cartoon snake, a cobra with its fangs bared and a menacing look in its eyes. You know how some paintings of people have eyes painted in such a way to give you an impression of the subject's gaze following you, as if you view it from different angles? Well, this piece didn't do that, but had some similar thing was going on where the eyes of the snake appeared to bore right into you straight through the page. I felt like the snake was going to strike up and dig its fangs into my arm. I didn't have a trippy experience like with the lion animation, but it was still surreal and unnerving. In addition to sections on art technique, Strobe had also included a number of seemingly random placed critiques of the state of animation that could generously be described as educated rants. A frequented target of his criticism was Walt Disney, who he decried as an amateur buffoon who was holding back the animation medium from its true potential. The author went on to emphasize that needing to be bold and daring in animation and willing to push social taboos. I returned the volume to the librarian. I hadn't discovered anything that would help me with my search to the aristocrat's tape, but at least I had come away with some interesting insights into the philosophy of a man who may have been behind it all. My next step was to visit Strobe's studio, which involved yet another cross-country road trip. I started to wonder how much gas money I would have ended up spending by the end of my search for that damned video. Was it really cheaper than flying? At least the studio was still standing, though I had arrived anticipating anything of major interest would have already been looted decades ago. Still, I held out hope as I pulled into a shopping center parking lot. The rest of my journey would have been on foot since the studio had predated modern roads. I crossed the interstate, there being only light traffic, and found and followed the old dirt road that would have been the sole source of vehicle traffic back then. By now, it was largely overgrown, and I cursed myself for not bringing a machete. It took me 2 hours to reach the location. It was on a one-story wooden building, with its windows boarded up, and foliage growing out throughout it. I walked to perimeter, looking for a way that I wouldn't open me up to charges of breaking and entering, though I seriously doubted anybody would even know or care I had been there at this case. To my disappointment, no entryway had been left by previous urban explorers, and I had to hack away at the borders of one window with the hatchet that I had brought. It may have been easier to smash down the door, but that felt somewhat less ethical. It was of course no source of light except for the now open window away, but I had the foresight to bring 3 high-power LED lamps in my backpack, which I now set up around the floor, relieved that I didn't see any scurrying or slithering. The place seemed smaller on the inside, barely more spacious than my basement at home. There was no furniture except for a couple of broken easels on the floor. They probably sold off the tables and desks to pay off their debts, I thought. Some scuff marks were visible on the wooden floor. There was a low wooden partition that sanctioned off a small segment of the room. I guess this is where the administration desk had been, while the rest of the floor was used for the actual animation work. Like I said, I hadn't really been expecting to find anything important, but was still disappointed. I spent the next couple of hours pacing the floor, wondering if this whole trip had just been a waste of time and mileage. I was about to pack up my lamps and leave when I discovered a trap door behind the floor partition. I had taken one of my lamps off the floor to perch it up on the top of the partition, and the lamp now allowed me to see outlines of a trap door along with its hinges and latches. The door was around 3 feet by 2 feet. I grew excited and opened it. Annoyingly, the door did not appear to have a mechanism for staying open, and was too heavy for me to hold it up. I had to back out through the window and back several times just to bring some rocks to prop it up, but the contents of the compartment were worth it. The compartment was about 3 feet deep, and contained what looked like diaphragms for animations and film devices, along with various little parts, knobs, bolts, lenses, and the like, all scattered at the bottom. I studied these with fascination, but couldn't make heads or tails of the schematics. I tried fitting some of the parts together with no success. I decided against taking these items with me. I had rationalized that violating the law by entering this place unlawfully was worth pulling back the curtain on whatever had caused my childhood trauma. But these items were unlikely to be of value to that end, and thus stealing them for my own curiosity would go beyond the bounds of that justification. However, I did photograph each and every one of them just in case. The next few months were uneventful. Once again, I felt like I had hit a dead end. I took a break from the mission and focused on life obligations. I had just managed to comfortably put a lost episode search on the back burner and feel content with what when I had received an email from the subject, "What you been looking for?" I hesitated a good few minutes before opening the message. "Hello. If you want answers, meet me at this address at this time." My heart raced. This email wasn't from any of the addresses that I had been messaged. I instinctively felt as though that I was finally getting closure, and was suddenly terrified. Perhaps even more terrified than I had ever been at this point in my journey. More than when I was run off from the road. More than when I was hypnotized by that cartoon lion. More than I had been threatened through that TV in the motel room. My hands were shaking so much I could hardly use a keyboard to navigate to a few new tabs and look up the address. It was an empty lot from an abandoned building that had been razed years ago. The Google Maps screen looked somewhat foreboding, but it was within comforting driving distance to my apartment, which terrified me even more to realize the sender knew the city where I lived in. Still, I asked off work for the specific date and was racked with dread until it arrived, barely able to concentrate on my job, and drove to the lot 3 hours ahead of time, parking my car in the street as was typical for the neighborhood. It was a sunny spring day, and the wind made me uncomfortable despite the warm weather. Each passing car made me apprehensive, particularly the one that appeared to slow down. I had an overwhelming urge to drive away as I appointed the time drew near. When the car stopped at the lot exactly at the time, I was surprised to see a woman get out. She had cropped red hair and appeared to be in her 40s. She was wearing a black leather jacket and walked right up to me. She smiled slightly. "Hi, you can call me Kathy. I'm from the group you've been looking for." I swallowed and rendered a quiet greeting. She didn't look threatening. I had trouble imagining what could have possessed her to join an organization like the Lost Media Group, but right now I had other things to be concerned with. "Don't worry, this isn't a setup," she reassured, rendering my apprehension. "If we wanted to do you in, we could have, and we would have done it already." "So, then, what do you want?" I interjected. "We want you to stop looking into us," she stated plainly. And to that end, I managed to convince the higher-ups to let me show you what you've been looking for so that you and we can put this behind us. "You mean that Aristocats video?" I asked. She nodded. "For security reasons, we obviously can't just give it to you. The best I could arrange was for you to be allowed to see it, under supervision, at one of the abandoned movie theaters we use to give private viewings of our works for select patrons. We're about to leave that location anyway, and needless to say, you shouldn't even think about telling people we were ever there." I nodded and grunted. If it meant finally getting answers, I was willing to pull up with a little more bullshit. "I hope you have a whole day free, because the theater is several hours away." I nodded again, suspecting that she already knew the answer. We got in her car and were off. We drove in silence for the first hour or so, and then I asked her why the group made lost episodes. She waited a few minutes before answering. "Well, I guess you could say we aim to change the status quo of programming, and give animators the chance to really test their limits. That's why I joined when the organization invited me." "And why did you leak them to the public if you wanted to keep them a secret?" I prodded. "We don't leak them. Sometimes they just get out and people who weren't intended to see them do. I don't know how you ended up seeing one of our works as a kid, but it wasn't supposed to be seen." "And what about the Kegabana broadcast?" "Some members of our organization was messing around when he wasn't supposed to. Or maybe it was a TV broadcaster only intending to be seen by members back when we were a little more lax about security. Look, I said we'd show you what we've been looking for. Beyond that, I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to satisfy your curiosity about our inner workings." I was silent for a few more minutes. Her answers were suspect. The Lost Media Group seemed like the type of people who would find pleasure in shocking and traumatizing random people with their twisted works. And I didn't quite buy all the exposure to non-insiders was intentional. I thought back to the FBI report. I wondered if she was completely happy with the choice that she had made to join the organization. "Well, I've already seen you're part of the Aristocats edit recently," I finally said. Kathy pursed her lips, and I could see in her eyes that she was briefly considered whether it was worth trying to pretend she didn't know what I was talking about. She decided against it. "Yeah, sorry about that, I guess. But I guess they'd figured that we'd give you a good scare that you might give up and leave us alone." I was annoyed at her choice of words, as if they were the only ones she wanted to be left at peace with all that time. I could only wonder if that had been her idea. I also wondered if she knew about several of the other projects as well. When you visited the old studio, that was when we decided it was time to make a peace offering to get you off our back. The theater appeared to be one of those many theaters that had been opened during the 90s blockbuster boom and then abandoned during the 2000s. It was along the interstate, isolated from any other buildings. We entered through the side door Kathy had a key for. The lobby was still unlit except for a sun outside. I could see a ticket counter, the concession area, and posters for old blockbusters on the wall. Covering the floor was a faded, colorful pattern. Adjacent to the small food court was the empty room that I guess used to be the video arcade. Kathy told me to give her my phone, which I did, and she escorted me down towards the gallery hallway in the last gallery. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to see this, and I answered yes, and she said that I could sit anywhere I wanted. I chose a seat near the back and she went up to run the projector. I began feeling scared. Sitting there in the dark abandoned gallery was very reminiscent of sitting in the dark watching the Aristocats all those years ago, except that all the extra space made it even more ominous. When the feature started, I could tell immediately that the audio was off. It sounded shrieky and low quality. Otherwise, the movie was normal up to the point where the old woman decided to get rid of the cats. Instead of drugging them and leaving them abandoned like in the normal movie, she drowned them in the river. It went downhill from there. Suddenly I was that 5-year-old boy again, watching in horror as characters were mutilated, decapitated, burned, all while strange videos and audio effects were still applied. One particular shocking scene featured real footage of cats attacking and killing a man. In real time, the lines were drawn over the scene, covering it in sketchwork until it had become a completely animated version of itself. It was done with absolute perfection of technique that I'm sure Stroby must have done that a bit himself. I eventually got a grip and was able to sit through the rest of the thing calmly. It wasn't pleasant, but I was at least relieved to finally be getting over with it. When it was over, I think I had tears in my eyes. Kathy drove me back to the empty lot, and it was dark by the time we arrived. Before I got out, she spoke to me one last time. Now listen to me. You found what you were looking for, and now that you have, you need to let it go. I took a big risk even pushing to let you in behind the scenes for that brief moment. If you continue pursuing information about our organization, we'll have to take more drastic measures. We exchanged goodbyes and she drove off. For years I kept my end of the agreement and never spoke a word about our encounter to anyone. However, recently I've been reconsidering the bargain. A few days ago, someone reached out to me on a web asking me for information on lost episodes. They claim to have seen one as a child and are hoping to find closure with their experience. I'm debating within myself whether it was worth letting them in on the secret, or if it would be better for my own sake if I convinced them they imagined the whole thing. And that, my little shadows, was... oh my goodness, I apologize. Lost episodes can be found again. A lost episode creepypasta by HopelessNightOwl. My final thoughts on the story? Definitely extremely long, but I'd have to say this was an amazing story. Like, flat out, absolutely amazing. I was not expecting this to actually be on the Creepypasta Wikia, especially given the fact that lost episode creepypastas are usually not often welcome on that site, but I mean, when I was looking around, I found this story and I had to narrate it. It's absolutely beautiful, like flat out, downright amazingly beautiful. It has such a perfectly well constructed and well-detailed explanation for everything that goes on within lost episode stories. And the fact that there's like a group or an organization completely behind these things is something that I can genuinely say was absolutely genius. I'd have to say, Midnight Night Owl, if that's what your name is, this thing's really, really long, by the way. Like, I'm talking very long. My throat's killing me right now. But let's get back to the review here. The entirety of this story was just completely and utterly amazing. I love the fact that how this all stemmed just from a memory that started off with, a kid by, when he was 5 years old, seeing the cats. I know I keep saying aristocrats. I do apologize for that. That's kind of my own thing, but the Aristocats movie and things like that. And of course, seeing all that crazy, disturbing, and violent imagery and things like that, I mean, that's something that's pretty terrifying when you think about it. And the fact that this one little thing tend to sparked up this entire search, and just more and more information just continuously getting developed into it, was very well detailed, very paced out, and just downright awesome. I mean, I love the story a lot. It's really, 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 really good. Another thing, too, about the story that I found relatively enjoyable is the fact that there was actually a better reasoning behind all of this. Now, I'd have to say that this is actually on par, if not a bit better, than Lost Episodes by Slime Beast, which I don't know if I ever will narrate that story, but honestly, this story, I think, actually kind of beats that one out. I mean, because with the Lost Episodes in Slime Beast, the main person that claimed the whole thing was just, well, I don't know, how do I put it? Basically, the whole origins of Lost Episodes was mostly just from one person. But in this story, it's actually a lot more believable and a lot more realistic to know that a ton more people and organizations and groups have actually sat there and created these things, as like a way to try and, be a little bit more free with animation, so to speak. Which is something, is a message I can actually say I firmly agree with. I do firmly believe that animation in of its own self should be a free thing, and that it shouldn't be completely and utterly regulated to just what the FCC says you can and can't do. I mean, I'm all for freedom of absolute speech. I apologize for the background noise, it's raining like crazy outside, but still. But even with that being said though, the story really did quite well. Now, do I have any negatives with the story? To be completely honest, other than the length of it being kind of crazy, I can't really find anything that particularly bad about it. The entire thing is just extremely interesting. The storyline is well done, the concept is interesting, and even though it did mention the Aristocats, we also got, other interesting origins more or less of other creepypasta stories. Kinda, sorta. But still, very interesting, very well done, very beautifully made. Hopeless Night Owl, you did a very darn good job with this creepypasta, and I have to say, you should be 100% proud of yourself for making something as amazing as this. Like, I actually, originally I was actually going to make something like this, but you know what? I'm not going to. This person did it better than I or Slime Beast or whoever could honestly do this. So honestly, congratulations, Hopeless Night Owl. You did a really darn good job. And I'm going to make sure that I link the story down in the description and the comment section below that way you guys can check the story out for yourself. It's a very well detailed, very well made, and very interesting storyline. And honestly, it deserves every ounce of love that it can get. But like I always say, this is simply my own personal opinion, and if you disagree with it, that's perfectly fine too. We're all entitled to our own opinions in regards to these creepypastas, and this is simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating of the story would have to be a flat-out 10 out of 10. Perfect storyline, interesting concept, a bit long, but overall just downright enjoyable. I love the story a lot, and it deserves every ounce of praise that it can get. A great story, and I might be the first person to actually narrate this. But yeah, if you go there, tell the person that Shadow sent you. That way they know that, these guys know that you did. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, but what did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you guys enjoy it? Did you guys not? Also, what would you have personally done to help make the story a lot better? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I'm the Shadow Reader. Thanks again for watching today's episode, and like always, roll the outro because I'm out. In fear and surprise as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from a fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at